Hey guys, Serac here, and today I'm going to bring you my Dogmatika-Shaddoll Albaz deck. This uses the new cards in the structure deck that's just been released, and no copies of Aluber whatsoever here, so I hope you enjoy the profile. Prices will be up in the corner for cards that aren't available in the structure deck. This deck is assuming that you buy 3 copies of the structure deck and working with a price of £30 for those 3 copies. Do not buy structure decks for scalped prices. There will be more copies of this structure deck out there. Okay, let's get into it. So we have 2 copies of the poster card, Fallen of Albaz. If it's normal or special summoned, except during the damage step, discard 1 card, fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters on either field as fusion material, including this card, but you cannot use other monsters you control. We're very rarely using this effect. It's obviously only really relevant in later turns of the game or if you're going second. Most of the time we're sending it with branded fusion, then banishing it, then recycling it back into the deck and searching it again, using our cards to generate an advantage loop like that, because the effect obviously doesn't do anything if you're going first, because it locks you out and you can't fuse from the hand either. But we need to see it, so we need to run a couple of copies. Next, we have 3 copies of Springen's Kit. Now, Springen's Kit is the replacement in this deck for Aluber. If you have a fusion monster that mentions Fallen of Albaz on your field or in your graveyard, special summon this card from your hand. If this card is normal or special summoned, add from deck to hand one of your branded spells and traps that is banished or in your deck, or graveyard. Then place 1 card from your hand on the bottom of your deck. So this gets you any branded spell from anywhere, but at the cost of putting a card back into the deck. This deck obviously has a few soft garnets in it that you don't really want to see, so having a way to put them back into the deck can be very, very useful. We then have 2 copies of Tri-Brigade Mercuria. Mercuria is a hand trap, allows you to negate a monster effect while you control a fusion monster that mentions Fallen of Albaz as material, and also if it's banished you get to add from your deck to your hand 1 Fallen of Albaz or 1 monster that mentions it except Tri-Brigade Mercuria. Again, very useful for going into cards with kit and so on and making plays from there. We then have 1 Albion the Shrouded Dragon. It becomes Fallen of Albaz while on the field or in the graveyard, and then if it's in the hand or graveyard, send 1 Fallen of Albaz or 1 branded spell from your hand or deck to the graveyard, and then apply the following effect. So if it's from your hand, you special summon it, so if you send the card from the hand, you special summon it, and if it's from the deck, so if you send the card from the deck, you place this card on the bottom of the deck, then draw 1 card. You're generally using this to send branded sword from the deck, and then cycling itself out of your hand for a replacement card. But very, very useful card. Obviously can be easily special summoned if you have a branded card that you can put in the graveyard, and so on. And of course it's a Dark Dragon level 8 monster that is relevant. We then have 2 copies of Dogmatika-Shaddoll. Now you should probably know what Shaddoll does by now if you've played any Yu-Gi-Oh at all in the past 2 years. Cannot be destroyed by battle by a monster special summoned from the extra deck. If a monster summoned from the extra deck is on the field, special summon this card from your hand. If this card is normal or special summoned, activate this effect, add 1 Dogmatika card from your deck to your hand except itself, and then it locks you out of the extra deck. Important thing, Dogmatika plays must be the last thing you do, otherwise you will be very sad and be locked out of the extra deck. We then play 1 Dogmatika Fleur-de-Lis. Fleur-de-Lis is, if a monster is summoned from the extra deck is on the field, quick effect, special summon this card from your hand. Then if you control another Dogmatika monster, negate the effect of 1 face-up monster on the field. And then when your Dogmatika monsters declare an attack, make all Dogmatika monsters gain 500 attack. So very useful as an extra interruption and to push through extra damage in the end, nearer the end of the game. 1 Dogmatika Maximus. Maximus can be special summoned by banishing a fusion, synchro, exceed, or link monster from your graveyard, and then you can activate its effect during the main phase, send 2 monsters with different names from the extra deck to the graveyard, and then your opponent does the same thing. and then it locks you out of the extra deck. Very important, very good card at giving you information and obviously triggering your graveyard effects of Albion, of Titaniclad, of even the Shaddoll cards, such as Apclone and obviously Entis. The important thing to remember is be very careful when you use this, otherwise you could end up having your opponent send their own Entis and their own Titaniclad, and then you've not gained any advantage from them sending it. One Shaddoll Beast, because drawing cards is nice, and this is a free turns branded fusion into a complete replacement of itself. One Shaddoll Falco, because it does the same thing and sets itself, which can be very useful if we have more fusion cards, or if we're going to set up things like Apclone later. It gives us another dark monster that we can banish without really worrying about it. One Shaddoll Dragon for going second. If your opponent set a card that you think is going to be a bit troubling, then you can activate this. Obviously, very useful for baiting things like Tri-Brigade Revolts, etc. And just being able to work around that. For our hand traps, we have 3 Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. This is the hand trap that comes in the deck. It's also very, very good at the moment because Adventurer is a thing, and that is really, really good against this card because we just hit the Fateful Adventure with it. The other hand trap we're playing is, of course, Effect Veiler. Again, was printed in the structure deck. Very, very easy to use card. Very, very powerful effect. For our spells, we have 3 copies of Branded Fusion. This is Shaddoll Fusion on steroids, basically. Fusion summon 1 fusion monster that mentions Fallen of Albaz as material from your extra deck using 2 monsters from your hand, deck, or field as fusion material. Cannot special summon monsters the turn you activate this from the extra deck. The turn you activate this card, except fusion monsters. Can only activate 1 per turn. This is your main spell card. This is the biggest Ash Magnet in the game, probably. And it really, really, really needs to go off for you to win. It obviously gets you access to everything in your extra deck. It sends Fallen of Albaz to the graveyard where you can recycle it. It sends Shaddoll monsters to the graveyard to get their effects. You run a decent number of light monsters as well. It sends so many different things to the graveyard that you can then utilise their own graveyard or effects when they're banished, like Mercuria, to just generate huge amounts of advantage off this one card. Three branded Lost. This is Magical Meltdown. Activation of cards and effects that include an effect that fusion summons a fusion monster cannot be negated. Note, it only stops activations. If you have this on the field and you activate Branded Fusion, your opponent can still Ash Blossom you, because Ash Blossom only negates an effect. Very, very important. Also, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects when a monster is fusion summoned this way. So your opponent cannot solemn any of your fusion monsters, and if they have any effect that activates when a monster would be special summoned, they would not be able to activate those. If you fusion summon a fusion monster, add 1 Fallen of Albaz or 1 monster that mentions it from your deck to your hand. Note, any fusion monster. Does not have to be an Albaz fusion monster. So this lets us pivot from the Shaddoll side into the Albaz side very, very easily. Recoups even more of the advantage that we gain from things like Branded Fusion. And it doesn't just search Albaz, obviously, it searches any monster that mentions it. 2 copies of Branded in White. This is Miracle Fusion. If you banish a Fallen of Albaz, it has to use a dragon monster as material. All of the Albaz fusions bar Mirror Jade are dragons. And it sets itself if you discard it for Albaz's effect. Obviously, we're avoiding cards like Branded in Red and Branded Opening because of how expensive they are, and we're not running any Despias. Branded Bond is Monster Reborn for Fallen of Albaz. It can also summon it if it's banished or in your hand as well, and sets itself if you need to use that. Very useful later in the game when your opponent has a board and you need to get an Albaz on the board so you can fuse away their board. And also hits Albion out of the graveyard or out of your hand so you can get another monster onto the board. We then have Nadir Servant. This is the classic Dogmatika search spell. Send one monster from extra deck to the graveyard, add one Dogmatika monster or Fallen of Albaz. This search is Fallen of Albaz as well. From deck or graveyard to your hand that has attack less than or equal to that sent monster. Also, for the rest of the turn, you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck. Again, the last thing you should do should be playing your Dogmatika engine. It's really, really important, otherwise you'll lock yourself out of the deck before you have finished your plays. We play 3 Pot of Extravagance. This comes in the structure deck. It's obviously a really, really good card. It says draw 2 cards on it. Just remember that if you activate this, you can't use things like Shaddoll Beast or Albion's effects to draw cards, but it's still very, very good. You won't see it every single game, and drawing 2 cards is usually better than drawing 1. Because of this card, obviously, we have some weird ratios in the extra deck because we don't want to banish all copies of any of our particularly important fusions. 1 Called by the Grave because Branded Fusion is the biggest Ash Magnet in the game. Simple as, it also comes in the deck. 2 Dogmatika Punishment as an easily searchable interruption, and obviously another way of sending cards from the extra deck to the graveyard to get important cards back, or get extra effects with things like Entis. 1 Branded Sword, this if it's in the graveyard, which is very, very easy to do with Albion. We can banish it at any branded, any monster that mentions Fallen of Albaz or Fallen of Albaz itself from our banish zone to our hand. So again, easy recycling for any of our monsters in the deck. And then finally, the last trap card we play in the main deck is Shaddoll Schism. Again, you know what this does. This allows us to make Winder on our opponent's turn. Very, very important card by banishing materials from field or graveyard. Stops it attacking directly, and then you get to non-targeting send to the graveyard a monster your opponent controls with the same attribute. Very, very good in this meta where there's going to be a lot of light and dark monsters, and obviously we can make Winder or Construct. So that is the main deck. For our extra deck, it's very, very simple. We have 2 copies of Mirror Jade the Iceblade Dragon, Fallen of Albaz plus 1 extra deck monster. You can only control 1 of it. Quick effect, you can send 1 fusion monster from your extra deck to the graveyard that mentions Fallen of Albaz, banish 1 monster on the field. Also, this card cannot use this effect next turn. If this fusion summoned card and its owner's control leaves the field because an opponent's card, you can destroy all monsters your opponent controls during the end phase of this turn. 3k attack. So it's got a quick effect, non-targeting banish, and nukes the field on its destruction. It's an amazing card. It's very, very easy to summon. It's the monster we're sitting on and relying on to win most of our games. Two copies of Lubellion the Searing Dragon, Dark Monster and Fallen of Albaz. If it's fusion summoned, discard a card, fusion summon a level 8 or lower fusion monster from your extra deck except Lubellion by shuffling materials mentioned on it into the deck from your monsters on the field, graveyard and or face-up banished cards. For the rest of this turn, this card cannot attack and you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except fusion monsters. Again, Lubellion, very, very strong card. Note, it doesn't need to special summon an Albaz fusion, it can be any fusion, so we can make our Shaddoll fusions with this card as well if we need to. Two copies of Albion the Branded Dragon, again comes in the structure deck, which is great. Very, very similar effect to Lubellion, but instead of having to discard a card, you just use, it's a miracle fusion, so you banish monsters from hand, field or graveyard. If it goes to the graveyard because it was sent there this turn, you can add to your hand or set one branded spell trap directly from your deck. And then you can only use each effect of Albion once per turn. 1 Titaniclad, this is the mandatory Dogmatika one, obviously helps us search things with Nadir Servant, can be sent with Mirror Jade to search more Dogmatika pieces if we need them, is another fusion target we can use with Albaz if our opponent has a big monster that we can fuse with. So a whole host of very, very useful attributes this. We're very rarely hard summoning it for its effect to gain attack, but it does come up occasionally and you do summon this card more often than you would think. 2 copies of Shaddoll App Cologne. We are never summoning this card. This is entirely used for searching Schism, because obviously you can dump this card with an Nadir Servant, and because we run a much higher dark quantity than a much higher dark ratio than decks say like Invoked Dogmatika-Shaddoll, we can pretty easily make Winder off this card. And speak of, we have 2 copies of Shaddoll Winder. We don't want to banish this card off Extravagance, which is why we're playing 2. Locks your opponent out of special summoning more than once per turn, can't be destroyed by card effects, and if it goes to the graveyard, add a Shaddoll spell trap in your graveyard and add it to your hand. 1 Shaddoll Construct. Again, sometimes you need to out a problematic monster, sometimes your hand doesn't add up and you can't quite make any of the Albaz fusions because you've got Shaddolls and light monsters access. Dumps a Shaddoll to the graveyard, so can draw you an extra card with Beast, set Falco, or pop a back row with Dragon. Obviously, it can also dump Schism and then add it back if you, say, link this card off into something like Verte. And at the start of the damage step, if this card battles a special summon monster, destroy that monster. People forget that line of text all the time. 1 Elder Entity Entus. This is our Dogmatika punishment target. Obviously, blowing up 2 monsters is nice. 1 Dark the Dark Charmer. Again, this deck is mainly dark monsters. If we can make it and then steal, say, our opponent's cards like their Albaz fusions, that's really, really good. So that's why we're playing this. And then finally, 1 Predaplant Verte Anaconda, because sending the branded fusion off this is hilarious and basically means your opponent has lost already, because you do not get the restriction on branded fusion, so you can make all the monsters you like. So, that is my Albaz build based off the structure deck, not using any Alubers, any expensive Despia cards, any Guardian Chimeras, or anything like that. I hope you enjoyed that profile, and I will see you again soon.